He birdied the opening 2 holes and then had a run of pars before a birdie at 16 was followed by this.
From Mark Ly's jaw-dropping performance in 1983 to Paul Lawrie's record-breaking outing in 1999, these are the greatest comebacks in the history of the PGA Tour. Let's begin with Mark's comeback in the Bank of Boston Classic. You see, Mark was 8 strokes behind heading into the final round of the tournament, and he was tied for 16th place. Everyone, including Ly, knew that his best bet was to just try and sneak into the top 10. But what followed was nothing short of phenomenal, as Mark left everyone speechless. The former athlete birdied 3 of the last 4 holes, which included an impressive tweeter on hole 18. He did his best and then waited for the leaders to do their thing, but they just couldn't catch up. John Mahaffey, Jim Thorpe, and Sammy Rachels were left stunned as they ended up a shot back in a tie for second place. Just imagine, after 5 hours and 64 strokes, Mark went from 16th to 1st on the leaderboard. But luckily for golf fans, another thrilling comeback came just 2 years later. It's none other than Hal Sutton's performance in 1985. He made his way into the St. Jude Memphis Classic as a respected golfer. At that point, Hal had 3 wins to his name, including a major. But he hadn't lifted a cup since he won the Wanamaker Trophy in 1983. Though that changed once Sutton decided to have one of the best performances of his career. He was also 8 strokes behind going into the final round. Sutton started off strong with 65, but then he had a pretty bad stretch from Friday to Saturday. He went into Sunday with basically nothing to lose, and the rest was history. Hal brought his A game and scored 65 for the second time. It was good enough to give him a spot in the playoffs against David Ogren, and before fans knew it, he defeated Ogren on the first hole of a sudden death playoff. It was an unbelievable comeback that played a huge role in helping Hal cement himself as the real deal. Speaking of the real deal, I've got to talk about the star of the 1990 Buick Open, the man himself, Chip Beck. Every fan knows him as being only the second player in the history of the tour to post a 59 in a competition. But don't let that overshadow what he did a year before that. Chip was 8 strokes behind heading into the last round, and all signs pointed toward it being a competitive finish between Hale Irwin, Bill Andrade, and Fuzzy Zeller. Beck wasn't even in the equation as such, though he didn't let that stop him and ended up putting on a spectacular performance. The man posted a phenomenal 65 to record a score of -16. And keep in mind, this was on a day when only 2 players broke 68. After Beck's sizzling performance, the rest of the guys just let the nerves get to them. Irwin posted a 74, Andrade a 77, and Zeller a 72. That left Chip as the last man standing. At least Beck was in his prime when he did this. But back in 1998, one man proved that you can make an amazing comeback no matter how old you are. Yep, I'm talking about Scott Simpson. He entered the Buick Invitational at the age of 42, and no one really expected much from him. After all, he was well past his prime, and that was clear from the fact that he hadn't won in 5 years. Heavy rainfall throughout the week shortened this event to 54 holes, but the brilliance on display from Scott was unforgettable. Much like the other comebacks, he was also 8 strokes behind heading into the final round. Though, with an unbelievable 64, Simpson turned things around for himself. He soon found himself in a playoff with Skip Kendall, and Scott put his experience to good use by hitting a fantastic chip from the right of the 18th green before hitting the 4-foot birdie putt. He was victorious and proved to everyone that he still had it. That said, Simpson isn't the only man who proved that you don't need to be in your prime to pull off an insane comeback. After all, Craig Stadler did it in the 2003 BC Open at the age of 50. Yep. Not only did he emerge victorious at the Ford Senior Players Championship on July 13, 2003, but he ended up doing something even more impressive just a week after that at the BC Open. The Walrus went ahead and carded 8 birdies as well as an eagle in the last round. Stadler capped off his outstanding round with a bird on the 72nd hole. With a score of 63 in the final round, he defeated the third-round leader and walked away victorious for the second Sunday in a row. Stadler came back from being down 8 strokes and became the first senior tour player to win on the PGA Tour. Now, all of the comebacks I've talked about so far were super special, but this next one's especially impressive. Why? because it's the ultimate tale of resilience, and it belongs to Kyle Stanley. Allow me to set the stage. Stanley started off the 2012 Farmers Insurance Open guns blazing as he had a 6-shot lead through 54 holes. But once he teed off on the 72nd hole, disaster struck. Kyle made a triple bogey 8 and soon found himself in a playoff, which he lost. The trophy slipped out of his hands and he was devastated. But then he pulled off something that was nothing short of phenomenal the very next week. It was the Phoenix Open, and even though he was faced with an 8-shot deficit, Stanley went off for a fantastic 65, allowing him to complete the improbable comeback. It was a performance for the ages, and the way he responded was just unforgettable. Speaking of unforgettable performances, though, how can I forget about Justin Rose's comeback in the 2017 WGC HSBC Champions Tournament? Dustin Johnson was the star of the show for the first 3 days, and he was leading by 6 heading into the final day. Unfortunately for DJ, he couldn't keep it up in the final round. So, it was the perfect opportunity for Brooks Koepka and Henrik Stenson to take advantage. Except they didn't. Instead, it was Justin who proved to have ice in his veins and played his final 8 holes to perfection, allowing him to come back from an 8-stroke deficit. But as great as that was, I'm gonna have to rewind a little to talk about the second greatest comeback in the history of the tour. Yep, it's Stewart Cink's performance in the 2004 MCI Heritage Tournament. You see, unlike every other comeback mentioned so far, he was faced with a 9-stroke deficit heading into the final round. And then, Stewart shot 64 to Ted Purdy's 73. Following that, they went up against each other in a playoff, and Cink won thanks to a birdie on the 5th extra hole. Though, if that wasn't enough drama, a fan claimed that Cink had gained an unfair advantage by moving some loose impediments. Stewart was then approached by a rules official regarding the violation, but thankfully, tour officials ruled that it had no merit, and he was able to complete the second biggest comeback in the history of the PGA. So now that begs the question, what was the biggest comeback ever? Well, it came in 1999, thanks to Paul Lawrie's heroics. It was the Open Championship. And while people always bring up Jean Van de Velde's insane collapse, Lawrie also deserves his laurels for putting on an absolute show. I mean, it was a tough day for everyone as 5 men shot in the 80s, while only 4 of them cracked 70. What's more, out of the 4 rounds in the 60s, 3 shot 69. Paul was trailing by 10 strokes heading into the final round, and after Jean's infamous triple bogey on his final hole, Paul came in and fired 67 like it was nothing. Then, he won the 4-hole aggregate playoff by 3 shots to cap off the greatest comeback the sport has ever seen. And there you have it. Those were the greatest comebacks in the history of the PGA Tour.